Have you ever wondered why difficult conversations are so hard to have? You might also be wondering what this has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. That illustrates the many facets of emotional intelligence and how to bridge the gap towards DEI. We are excited to have you here with us today. This conversation is going to be fantastic. I'm looking forward to you all meeting my co host. We value your feedback and opinions. Please drop them in the chat. We intend to respond to as many comments from our audience as possible. This takes a great deal of effort to pull off, and I'm eternally grateful to all our guests and our loyal listeners. Follow Diversity Connects Us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm a DEI consultant and authoress of Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The link to purchase the book will be in the comments. And for a living, I help organizations implement DEI plans and reframe their cultural mindsets through thought-provoking workshops and webinars. Join us as we continue to share the different voices in the DEI space. Here today is a trailblazer in his own right. Thank you so much, Dr. Rudell, for joining us today. If you'd like to introduce us.
Thank you so much for having me yet again on this podcast. So my name is Enan Rudell. I'm an organizational psychologist and psychotherapist by trade, and I've spent a number of years studying the human condition and some of the factors that often prevent us from functioning optimally in our day to day across life domains. So I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation. And with that, Rachel, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you. So we've spent the last few episodes talking about EQ and how it could be used to diffuse conflict by identifying it as a tool for helping people reach places of shared understanding. So in terms of best practices, are there any specific strategies or approaches you would recommend someone to use in an effort to mitigate conflict?
So, great question. There are a few strategies for helping to sort of mitigate conflict and enable folks to reach that place of shared understanding. And it really begins with some self reflection first. How you are matters in that moment. Are you in a place where you are willing to work towards reaching a solution? Are you in a problem solving space? So that's sort of the first stage that I would encourage uh, people to sit in when entering into difficult situations. Next would be, now that you've done sort of the internal reflective piece, next would be reflecting on the other person as well, and really sort of honing in on the emotional energy that they may be sitting with in that moment. And of course, um, you're not going to know unless you ask and unless you create a space for them to share. But there certainly should be, I would encourage some awareness around internal reflection as well as external as a beginning point. The next tip that I would offer up, even with the best of intentions, conversations can often go south, right? So, someone in the equation, I would encourage commit themselves to knowing and returning to the purpose of the conversation in moments when things feel like they're going south. And what that might look like is simply pausing and acknowledging the moment, naming through your lens, from your perspective, what you believe is happening in that very moment. Next would be the idea of managing our assumptions and avoiding taking personal attacks personally, right? Or I guess let me rephrase that. It would be steering clear of framing the message that's being delivered to you as a personal attack, all in an effort to stay as strength based as possible and focused on reaching that point of shared understanding. So we've talked about a lot there. One thing that I would offer up to just sort of add to these tips and strategies is this idea of practicing the conversation first. And I'll give you an example of what that might look like. Boiling your thoughts down to the 3 or 4 talking points that you're looking to convey as a way of framing your thinking. That's going to do a few things. It ensures that your thoughts are succinct and intentional and purposeful. It also creates, it increases the likelihood of the conversation staying on task and not sort of veering into that space, or devolving, I should say, into the space where a dialogue begins to resemble a debate, which even with the best of intentions can happen.
Wow. So you said a mouthful, and as you were talking, a few things came to mind. And you mentioned a psychological safe space. So if someone's coming in already emotionally charged with whatever emotions are occurring within their body, physically or mentally, how can that space be created for that person who's coming in emotionally charged? How can a psychologically safe space be available for that person?
So I would encourage the individual or individuals that they're interacting with to name what it is that they're seeing, to create a space for that person to say, in fact, how they're feeling and what they're experiencing. I think oftentimes when we're robbed of the opportunity, it just sort of decreases. It not only decreases psych safety, but it then increases our defense mechanisms. So one of the best ways to diffuse a person's defense mechanisms is to acknowledge that they're likely experiencing or likely going through a difficult moment, or having a difficult time with whatever it is, and engaging them in a conversation around why. Now, it's not engaging them in that conversation so we can prove a point. It's engaging them so we can gain insight into their perspective.
Right. But this probably goes into our second question. Once that conflict, because that's an inner conflict they're having, once that's been diffused, then can the conversation move into, a non-debatable conversation? Because before it could be a debatable conversation, and then now that the mindset has been shifted, can now the conversation be um, can it be positive is the word I'm
Yes,
looking
yeah.
for.
Yeah, and so I think following these steps and giving the process its due diligence will likely increase, or is likely to increase the likelihood of a productive conversation taking place from that point on. So far too often, two or more emotionally charged individuals enter into a space without that shared understanding of um, what the other person might be sitting with, and oftentimes enter in without having full understanding of what they themselves are feeling in that moment. So anything that can be done to bring that sense of understanding to the forefront will increase the likelihood of then from there a productive conversation taking place.
Right. So how important is it then to self-monitor when entering into these difficult conversations?
It is critical, and I would I would say that we have to know where we're at first, right? It begins and ends with use of self, our self. How am I feeling as I enter into this conversation? Because if I'm agitated, if I'm frustrated, if I'm upset, if I'm angry, if I'm anything along those lines, I run the risk of it coming out in ways that will ultimately decrease the effectiveness of the conversation. So self monitoring is key. And in fact, to add to that, there's no shame in saying to someone, I can't have this conversation right now. I am not in the best space to hold this type of conversation, and I'm going to need some time to process. Now, what I would say to that is make sure that you then follow up, right? Because oftentimes people say that and then walk away and never revisit the situation, which then leaves the other person maybe feeling like their needs weren't met. I used to do a lot of couples work during my time as a therapist. And so when we think about conflict resolution within the context of relationships, and this could be intimate, this could be workplace, whatever it is, it's important that we understand what's happening for us physiologically in that moment. Simply stated, your thoughts will have an impact on how you feel, which in turn shows up in what you do and how you come across. So self-monitoring then becomes critical to this process of holding productive conversation.
Right.
Well,
I want to welcome Toki Tagori. She's a loyal listener to our show, and she says here in three words: pause and effect.
yes.
And to give the listeners a little bit of context, that's just to pull back and to not impulsively have a response.
Right.
Right? So to pause, pull back, reflect, and then have a different effect.
Yes.
Correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when I mentioned a moment ago about practicing the conversation first, one of the things that I would say is that that's critical for a number of reasons, but oftentimes, and I certainly do this, I'll be triggered by an interaction with, let's say, a colleague, and I'll go to fire off an email. And I've now conditioned myself to put that email in draft. Go back when I'm now approaching it from a less emotionally charged place and see if that's still the message that I want to convey. Because for me, the majority of the time, at that point, when I'm now less emotionally charged, that's now not actually the message. Or even if it is, I'm likely to reframe it in a more a positive, sort of strength-based way so that it can be heard in the manner that I'm hoping it'll be heard.
That's huge. I think also with technology and everything happening so quickly, like you said, we're very quick to fire off emails or fire off a text message, and putting it in draft
Yeah.
allows you to pause and reflect, to pull back when you're less emotionally charged, because then the message will be conveyed very differently when you go back to that email.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so think about when we're not giving the process due diligence and we're having those knee-jerk reactions, those are the moments where relationships get damaged, intimate or professional or in any setting. So, there's a lot at stake here when we think about holding these types of conversations, which is why it's important to pay attention to the process.
It's interesting you mentioned process. There's a show we were watching last night. He's a psychologist himself. It's Dr. Paul Stutz. And he mentioned enjoying the process and not the destination. and how the process is what people need to reflect on, and because during that process you can still change your thought process, your mindset, everything that comes into us as being, complex human beings before getting to that end result.
So critical to holding effective communication. At the point that we can be open to viewing it as a process, that becomes the point where we're doing the self-reflection, we're doing the external reflection, we're understanding intent versus impact, we're understanding the goal of even having the conversation. What's the objective? Are you just trying to blow off some steam, or do you want to be heard? To what degree are you trying to reach that place and point of shared understanding? So all of this becomes a part of the process. It's so much bigger than the actual conversation itself. And I think that's what I'm looking to convey, is that there's almost a measure of pre-work that I would actually pre and post that I would consider. And the post would be sort of now looking back on the conversation and reflecting on talking points. What landed, versus through your lens, from your perspective, what didn't, and where does that process with that person go from there?
Right. So through your work as an organizational psychologist and former therapist, what challenges have you seen people typically struggle with when utilizing these approaches?
The biggest challenge that I've seen surface, and this is for most people, is around that reflective piece, because it's really hard to reflect in a way that's going to allow us to want to understand the other person's perspective, because the majority of the time we're so worked up that the sole focus in that moment is getting our point across. So it's more, it devolves into more of a chess match and less about building a bridge. And so a lot of my work has been helping people understand the value of creating these.
So I think we've have some internet issues, but we did miss what you said earlier, Dr. Udell.
Okay, so can you hear me okay now?
We can.
Okay, so so much of this is managing, sort of how managing our energy and being committed to a willingness to build that bridge, because it very much is about building bridges and less about a chess match, who's right and who's wrong. When we think about the fundamental differences between dialogue versus debate, just to name a few, when we consider dialogue at its core, I have a few characteristics here. I'm looking at my notes. Dialogue is rooted in understanding. It's rooted in reaching a place of understanding. It's rooted in wanting to create a space for mutual learning and collaboration. You are listening to understand. Now, to shift and look at debate very much is rooted in a win versus loss mindset. Who's right?
Right. It's a power struggle.
Right. A power struggle, which far too often then leads to that conversation being unproductive.
Right. And in a previous episode, you spoke about the importance of listening and the role that listening can play in helping people reach places of shared understanding. What specific strategies would you encourage someone to use when engaging and listening? Would you like me to repeat it? Because I think we lost you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Would you mind repeating the question?
Sure, absolutely. It says, so in a previous, no, I mean, I don't mind. So in a previous episode, you spoke about the importance of listening and the role that listening can play in helping people reach places of shared understanding. What specific strategies or best practices would you encourage someone to use when engaging and listening? Would you like me to repeat the question?
No, because I think I'm picking up what you're putting down. You're asking.
So what specific strategies or best practices would you encourage someone to use when engaging and listening? I think we're having some network issues. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah, not sure what's going on, but it keeps going in and out on my end. Okay, so just to speak to listening, listening is the other fundamental tool in holding effective communication. So it's twofold. We have the dialogue itself, but there needs to be, I mean, there's someone on the other end at any given moment when that dialogue is taking place, right? So you have the person conveying the message and you have the person who's receiving the message. So in terms of listening, are we listening in a way that will help us better understand the other person's perspective? Because that's really what the listening component is about. If we're simply listening to then, like if I'm just listening to you, waiting for the moment when you stop talking so then I can jump in and prove a counterpoint, what's really been accomplished in that exchange? Did I even hear you? And
Mm,
to what degree am I actually understanding your message? So there's active listening, right? Making the eye contact and demonstrating that you're listening, but then there's the reflective listening as well, where I might repeat back to you what you've said to let you know that A, I hear you, but B, to open up pathways in case maybe what I heard differs from what you said. It
correct.
creates that opportunity for clarity, which is critical when diffusing or mitigating conflict.
I'm happy you said that. I'm going to share a personal story. We had early on when we were dating, we had, not you and I, but my, myself and Christopher. So what we did, we had a premarital counselor 3 months into our relationship, and one of the exercises that he said to do was exactly what you just said. So it was very fun, and it was 30 seconds each. So we basically had to say what we did throughout the day or how we were feeling throughout the day. And then the other person had to repeat verbatim what we said. And he said that alone shows with practice how to build empathy and how to listen to what the person was saying and to be able to process the information, and then the other person would say, okay, well, this is what I said and this is how I felt. And then the other person would say, well, I heard you say this is how you felt. And then begins the dialogue, as opposed to, he said, if you don't repeat it verbatim, then the person will see it and in their perception and might not be able to perceive it the way that you've actually delivered the information.
I love that exercise. I love that.
Oh, we lost each other again. You know, it's still wonderful to have, the possibility to be able to have these enlightened conversations. But go ahead.
So I was saying that I appreciate that exercise, and actually what surfaced for me, and thank you for sharing that. In my work, when I was working as a therapist with couples, occasionally I would get people that say, you know, I feel like when my spouse or significant other is talking to me, I'm thinking about, other things. I'm thinking about errands I have to run. I'm thinking about chores I need to do around the house or whatever it is. And so I've worked with couples around the active and reflective listening piece. And oftentimes, what it would look like, uh, just to give an example here, it's, can I listen to you at the level where when you're done speaking, I can pose a question based on what you've shared with me, right? So in order for me to do that, I have to be engaged and or invested enough to process what you're saying to me and then formulate a question that maybe either builds on something you've said or creates a space for you to maybe go a little bit deeper on anything that you've said. So, those types of exercises can deepen our ability to listen effectively. So, just as I suggested practicing difficult conversations before you enter into them, there's some work that we can do around listening as well, right? Like, for example, committing to giving your full attention to the person. So instead of engaging in some other task while the person's walking around, physically, stop what you're doing, shift your body, look directly at the person, and demonstrate that active listening. So there's things that we can do to get better on both sides of this equation. It is an equation. We need both in order for the end result to be that point of shared understanding.
Right. And is there, how are we, once we are, when you think of emotional intelligence, I think once we become more self-aware and able to control and manage our own emotions, then, the delivery of any conversation is completely different, right?
Absolutely. And it goes back to that reflective component that we talked about
Right.
at the top of the call. Uh, Self-reflection, external reflection, but a general sense of awareness and being in tune.
Right. So what would be the key takeaway?
I would say the importance of viewing communication as a process
Mm,
and understanding that on the surface, I am talking to you and you are talking to me. But right below that, there are several other factors that deserve consideration if, in fact, this conversation is to be effective and or productive.
right. So Davia Austin, thank you for tuning in. Here she says he read my mind, awareness. And
Mhm.
there's a LinkedIn user that said, well said. A lot of claps, a lot of applause to everything that you've shared with us, Dr. Rudell. So he read my mind,
Mhm.
awareness.
Yeah, it's well, and first of all, thank you all for that. Um, I'll just offer this up. It's really hard. I mean, we're sitting here and we're talking about these concepts, but talking about it and doing it, especially when we're in an emotionally charged place, that's actually the moment when we need to challenge ourselves the most.
Mm,
When we're not emotionally charged, yeah, we can give, we can receive all sorts of information, but it becomes critical. Um, I'll throw myself under the bus. There are moments, anyone who's close to me knows this, where I might say, I can't engage in this conversation right now. I'll find a way to say that because I know I'm not in a place where that conversation is going to be productive. So again, that awareness of self, it matters. It matters.
Absolutely. There's so much more that we could talk about that
Mhm.
we'll save for our next session or our webinars and workshops, so we can take a deeper dive. But as we
Absolutely.
reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening. This podcast highlights lived experiences and inspirational stories of strength and tenacity. We will share profound and courageous dialogues that influence DEI and emotional intelligence by breaking the barriers of labels, stereotypes, and confronting biases, and offering best practices to achieve a more significant and cultural mindset. Stay tuned as we continue to share our voices in the DEI space. To trend with us, hashtag Diversity Connects Us.